Hello and welcome to games that left my collection in 2018. This is a list of 10 games I've gotten rid of over the last year or so. Not every game needs to stay in your collection, especially not if you found a game that does much the same thing, only a lot better for you. But what I think is interesting is the rationale behind why I got rid of each game, why they're no longer taking up shelf space, and why I've handed them on to someone else so they can have enjoyment with them. So let's get straight into it. And the first game I got rid of was CO2. Now CO2 is actually a pretty damn good game. I actually really enjoyed this. The environmental theme and the carbon credit trading was really neat. However, a second edition's coming out, and I'm actually not getting that second edition. You see, one of the guys I played the game with, who's one of my best friends, is one of New Zealand's experts on the carbon trading scheme. So he goes off to conferences internationally to talk to people about emissions trading, and he ordered the second edition. And I figured, well, I'm probably going to be playing the game with him most of the time because he's part of my regular group. And as an expert in this field, it really feels like he should be the one that owns the game and not me. And in some ways, this is a pretty important lesson for me. I don't have to be the one that owns everything. I don't have to be the person in the group that owns every single game. Other people can own games and I can borrow them off them. That's fine, that's great. Especially when the game is of particular interest to that person. I suspect some of you watching are that person in your group, the one that owns absolutely everything. And while that's a cool position to be in because you've got a whole bunch of games, sometimes you feel like you're the one accepting all the financial risk and cost of everyone enjoying the hobby. So it's actually quite neat for other people in your group to go, actually, this is the game I want to own. I want to add this to my shelf. And for you to go, cool, you get that one. That's awesome. I don't need every single game. Next up is Dead Panic. Now, the same guy who owns CO2 also owns Castle Panic, and we played that a couple of times, and I thought it was a really neat little game. It just had really cool basic mechanics, it was a fun co-op, and a great little shared experience. And I thought, oh well, I wouldn't mind getting that for my collection, because of course I have to have every single game I play at other people's houses. But then I saw they were releasing Dead Panic, and I was like, oh, I can get a game that's actually slightly different. Zombie theme, oh, that might be quite fun. Turns out it wasn't. Turns out the simplicity of Castle Panic is kind of undermined by the extra mechanics added in Dead Panic, and I thought the mix just didn't work. Where Castle Panic was a nice light game that you can pick up and play easily and just have a good laugh about, Dead Panic just didn't work. Something about how the characters moved around the board and interacted with the zombies just made the game not feel right. What I'd gone and done is thought, I'll get Castle Panic. Castle Panic was fun. Oh, I'll get Dead Panic instead. That should be just as fun. And it turns out they're actually quite different. It's a classic case where I probably should have just gone, actually, I enjoy the original game. Let's just play my friend's copy. Let's not bother reaching for something else. So yeah, no regrets getting rid of Dead Panic. Next up is a game from my list of games I played entirely too much, and that's Elder Sign. The problem I had with Elder Sign is I actually don't mind the game at all, but I played the app like 100, 200, God knows how many times on the way to work. It was a perfect length for a game for my bus ride into work each day, and for a while there I was playing it quite a bit. The problem with that is I'd go to set up the board game and I'd be like, why am I doing this? This just takes forever. The app absolutely killed my interest in playing this as a solo on the tabletop or as a multiplayer game. I mean, Elder Sign's not a bad game at all, it's just probably a better phone app than a board game. I really wanted to like Descent 2nd Edition. I really enjoyed Descent, and when 2nd Edition came out, I was really amped up about it, and I picked up the core box. And a friend of mine picked up the core, and a few other bits and pieces as well. And we played a full campaign, the one in the initial box. And it was okay, but it wasn't particularly good, and I had some real problems with some parts of the game. In particular, how wounded characters are treated. You get knocked down, you get to stand back up with stuff all hit points, and you get knocked back down again. So it encourages behavior from the Overlord player where they just focus fire on one character and just keep wounding them over and over and over again. And that makes it really unfun for one person who's getting picked on. So that wasn't me in the campaign game. I was playing a rogue character that I'd min-maxed so they could move about 20 spaces in a turn. So even if the Overlord did want to hit me, I was already at the objective at the other end of the map. I also own Imperial Assault, which I think does this a lot better. The Overlord character in that has to split their fire and try to wound all 4 characters, which just makes for a more interesting experience for everyone, because one person's not being picked on. And well, there's only so many dungeon crawlers you can play, and I've got Imperial Assault, Descent 1st Edition, and Gloomhaven, and that's enough to keep you occupied for a pretty bloody long time. Next up, a real controversial opinion, Eldritch Horror's garbage. Okay, it's not garbage. but I really like 2nd edition of Arkham Horror. Most of the praise I heard for Eldritch Horror was that it was faster, it was streamlined, it was just a better Arkham Horror. And as someone who's played like 200 plus games of Arkham Horror, I was so excited to get Eldritch Horror. And then it hit the table. And all I could think was, this is an improved version of Arkham Horror? Wow, I must be totally out of line with what everyone else is thinking, because I'm not enjoying this at all. And the reasons I didn't enjoy it were as follows. In Arkham Horror, clues were quite plentiful. So you had this push your luck aspect where you might have banked 6 or 7 clues, and you just spend one at a time to roll additional dice. This created a bit of tension within the game as you're like, I'm burning my resources, is this actually worth all the stuff I'm burning to do this? And that created quite an interesting bit of tension, because you might burn 2, panic about the 3rd one, and then get lucky on it. Or then you might fail it and go, I've just completely wasted most of my resources and now I can't do the thing I want to do. Eldritch Horror reduced the dice pools of characters quite a bit, and also reduced the ability you had to reroll dice. So frequently your turns were, turn over a card, check what skill I've got, oh, I'm rolling 2 dice, do I get a 5? No rerolls, no ability to modify that, just 2 or 3 dice to roll. If I get a 5, I succeed. If I don't, I fail. In Arkham Horror, you could adjust the sliders on your character to prepare for situations if you knew what was coming. If you needed to close a gate, you could boost your fight or your will and make sure that that roll was easier. There's none of that in Eldritch Horror. Now, I've heard that in the expansions they add focus tokens and a few things that help you re-roll stuff, but that's fixing the game after I'd played it enough to want to get rid of it. The other thing is, we played Arkham Horror so much that we know the game inside out, so it takes 2 hours for a 4-player game. This isn't the 6, 7, 8 hour game that people talk about for us. So Eldritch Horror wasn't any shorter, but it just felt shallower. Now, there is some stuff I did like about Eldritch Horror, which I would have loved to have seen in Arkham Horror. Specifically about the great old ones. They made them more characterful, and the mysteries that you had to solve were more interesting and varied. But the core gameplay boiled down to, turn over a card, do I roll 2 to 4 dice? If I get a 5, I succeed, and it just felt really, really flat. Oh, and playing Charlie Kane might be the most boring experience in board game history. You sit in a location, you buy stuff, you give it to other people. It really bugs me when the optimal way to play someone is so utterly boring. Anyway, got rid of Eldritch Horror, 0 regrets, still play Arkham Horror. Still haven't played Arkham Horror 3rd edition though. I guess we'll get to that at some point. And speaking of disappointing games from Fantasy Flight Games, here's Fallout. Now, I am a huge Fallout fan. I've played Fallout, Fallout 2, Fallout Tactics, Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, and Fallout 4. Haven't played Fallout 76, or the ones that were on console. Big fan of the franchise, and Fallout was one game I was really looking forward to. I mean, I was super excited about this. An adventure game by Fantasy Flight Games, who are known for doing games with big bling and lots of parts and stuff. And I was kind of hoping for an Arkham Horror type game set in the Fallout universe. And what we got was this competitive game with a weird victory point system and huge gaps in its narrative. One thing that drove me up the wall was when a character would be at one location, discover a clue, but then anyone could act on it. So if you were on the opposite side of the map, you could go and complete that assignment, and it just didn't make any sense to me. And the victory point system was just bizarre. It just wasn't the game I wanted from Fallout. And I really gave this a go. I played it like half a dozen times, and each time I was like, this just feels incomplete. It feels undercooked. It feels like a starter box for something that's going to have a hell of a lot more content that's going to validate it later on. And I'm kind of over that business model of buying a core box that's incomplete and pretty broken, and then having it patched by expansions. Kind of the same deal with Eldritch Horror. I figured the game was going to get fixed eventually, but did I want to buy the 6 expansions that would do that? For me now, if a game's core box doesn't deliver solid content and solid play experience, I'm not going to buy all the expansions that fix it later on. Sorry, Fantasy Flight. Foreclosed is next. Wow, this is just a terrible game, but in my defense, I didn't actually purchase this. I bought a game from overseas via the BGG market, and when I opened the game, Foreclosed was inside, and I messaged the guy and was like, hey, cheers for the game's all good, but why is there a copy of Foreclosed in there? And they were like, oh, oops, that's where that is. Yeah, just keep it. And after looking through the game and having a go at it, I was like, wow, I know why they didn't want this back. It's garbage. Like, I try not to be negative about too many games unless they're absolute abominations, but Foreclosed is just rubbish. So, in the interest of paying it forward to people, I added it to a game I traded away without telling the person. So they got to open the box up and go, oh wow, there's a bonus game in here. And I'm like, oh, that's where that is. So if you ever do end up with a terrible game and you're in a trade of some description, just chuck it in the box and hand it off to someone else so they can have fun with it. You never know, it might end up with someone who actually likes the game. But in Foreclosed case, I'd be really, really, really surprised. Next up's a very popular and iconic game, Fury of Dracula. Now, Fury of Dracula is not a bad game, and I'm not going to rip on it, but I have some issues with it. The biggest is that it's just a pain to teach people. If you are teaching people, you have to play Dracula. As a new player picking up Dracula is going to really struggle and have to ask questions about what the different cards do. And an experienced Dracula against a group of people who don't know what they're doing is going to run rings around them. And that's not necessarily a positive play experience. You either have to play down so people can learn the game, or you play to your ability and people just get stomped. I also think there's just a bit too much happening in the game. It's one of those 1980s games that had a lot of moving parts and a lot of extra rules that might not necessarily add that much to the experience. But the death knell for Fury of Dracula was last Friday, which is a simpler, more streamlined, hidden movement game with a Friday the 13th theme, which I really like. And that's also one that's a lot easier to teach. And because of the way the rounds reset, having a strong first act as the killer doesn't really determine the outcome of the game. This is just a case of having a game I wasn't going to play particularly often, and having a game on the shelf which I thought did much the same thing, only in a better, more streamlined way, with a theme I preferred. So, yeah, last Friday gets the nod, Fury of Dracula gets sent on to someone who'll appreciate it. And on that note, Shadows over Camelot is another one I got rid of. Shadows is a pretty damn good game. It was the first hidden trader game I played, and I played this a bunch in the 2000s. But ever since Battlestar Galactica came out, this one's been sitting on the shelf gathering dust. I don't know if I'd played it in like 6 years when I finally decided to get rid of it. And that's not because it's a bad game at all. It's just because the groups I play with, if they want that hidden trader experience, they're gonna play Battlestar Galactica. And Shadows over Camelot just occupied much of the same space. And I know there's people that prefer Shadows, and that's fine, that's all good. It's actually a pretty damn good game. But for my particular audience, my particular groups, Battlestar wins every single time when we said, which one of these do you want to play? I've also got Dead of Winter, which would sometimes get into the play schedule ahead of Battlestar, but with both those games on my shelf, Shadows over Camelot had no chance. And finally, the number 3 ranked game on Board Game Geek, Through the Ages, A New Story of Civilization. I say this a lot, but no game is for everyone, and Through the Ages is not for me. It's also not for the groups I played it with, who thought the game was absolutely awful. Now, I appreciate Through the Ages for its design, and I've actually ended up playing it a fair bit on the app, because that does all the bookkeeping for you. But it's just such a time consumer. There's so much fiddling around with cubes, and the game just has a heck of a lot of downtime when it's someone else's turn. There are a few other points I particularly didn't like about the game as well. The first of which is, if you're in last place militarily, you are everyone's target, and you just get absolutely stomped by everyone. And the game also has way more player in first place gets heaps of cool stuff, the player in last place gets stuffed cards than any other game I've ever played. So a lot of games have catch-up mechanics, but Through the Ages is just full of beat-down mechanics, which was not particularly fun for the person in our group who was in last place and just kept getting screwed over and over and over during the game. There's also the thematic disconnects that I don't particularly like. Having an army of cannons and phalanxes fighting against jet fighters. The ages fly past so fast, whilst also taking forever. It's a strange combination of a game being simultaneously too deep and busy while being thematically really light. And that combination just didn't work for me. But as I've said, I've played it on the app, and I appreciate it as an app game because I can play a game of that in about 20 to 30 minutes instead of 4 hours. My only real regret with this one is that I got rid of it just before I started the channel, because despite my reservations with the game, I think it's one that would do quite well as a 3-minute recap, because I suspect there's a lot of people out there who have found the game intimidating and complex, but would like to see a simple summary of it. So at some point, I'm probably going to have to borrow someone's copy and do a video of it. But anyway, those are the games I got rid of in 2018. If you enjoyed this video, like it, subscribe to the channel, and check out our Patreon.